You're listening to the PropTech Pioneers podcast. This podcast brings startups and MLSs closer together by exploring the beauty and the struggle of real estate data and technology. I believe real estate is on the cusp of a major transformation driven by better access to data, a new crop of pragmatic founders, and pent-up frustration with the status quo. These are conversations with those pioneers that are leading that transformation within the MLS landscape. I'm your host, Evan Knowles. I'm an entrepreneur building a fintech company called Simba that helps realtors manage their financial health using MLS data. And I wish I had access to these conversations earlier in my journey. So I thought I'd help future entrepreneurs and MLS executives learn from each other in a more open and accessible fashion. I hope you enjoy. Now let's jump into it. All right, welcome back to the PropTech Pioneers podcast. I've heard today's guest referred to as saints, heroes, and badasses. So today's guests are Sam DeBord and Josh Darnell. So Sam has an unbelievable amount of experience in the brokerage, technology, and organized real estate space. He's the CEO of RESO, which stands for Real Estate Standards Organization. And then Josh Darnell is the CTO of RESO. He has an unbelievable amount of experience in numerous startups and MLS technologies across the country. I've been super excited about this episode because the MLS landscape is something that I've dove into headfirst over the last couple of years, and it's extremely complex. I've developed a pretty good understanding of the space, and I believe there's no more important topic than data standardization. The work that Sam, Josh, and team are making is going to make a huge difference for years to come throughout the real estate industry, because it is impossible for the real estate industry to evolve without data standardization. It just can't happen. So in this episode, we'll talk about the evolution of the MLS landscape. Why is it the mess that it is? The origins of RESO, the goals of RESO and the KPIs that they track, the international expansion of RESO and how other countries are thinking about data standardization and beginning to develop systems like our own MLS. We'll also talk about what MLSs can do better to support innovation and startups. We'll talk about best practices for startups. Josh and Sam both have a ton of startup experience in dealing with innovation, so they have some great tips. And then we'll even give a demo of their analytics product and some of the latest features so that innovators can begin to understand how to leverage and navigate the data landscape in ways RESO can help with that. So with that, we'll jump into it.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So I was doing some thinking, I've spoken with both of you separately outside of this context, and I was doing some thinking on, what's the best way to set the context and just set up the conversation for, the listeners, both that are startup founders, but also the MLS execs. And I think one of the most interesting parts about the MLS landscape is really how it's evolved over time and why it is the way it is. Because if you really understand the evolution of it, you can start to understand the challenges that it faces, but also how it's evolved from a technology perspective. So let's start with, before the internet, the MLSs were big books and brokers were pulling together their listings on paper. So get into that origin of the MLSs and how it really kind of came together from a collaboration standpoint, and then take it into the internet and where we are today. Obviously, we don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but walk us through kind of that evolution on a high level, Sam and Josh.
Sure. I think that's technologists will understand very clearly why we are where we are with technology as they kind of hear the landscape of how things came together. So obviously, almost everything was done on paper originally. Realtors created realtor associations. They decided it was better for the marketplace, for brokers and for consumers to have, aggregated listings in one place. Actually, even before books, they started putting together just note cards. And people would have Rolodex files of listings. And as these marketplaces decided we needed more collaboration and cooperation there were books that went around and they'd get printed. And it was a little bit like the movie The Jerk, when the new phone books come out and he's very excited. The brokers would get very excited when a new version of the real estate MLS listing books came out. But importantly, at that time, there were more than 1,000 realtor associations, and they really generally were the professionals in those marketplaces who set the standards, who got their local and state authorities to create licensing rules and professional standards. So they're very siloed, very decentralized all over the U.S. and similar situation in Canada. Whereas most of the MLSs that we see in the world until the last couple of years were really focused in the U.S. and Canada. We're seeing a lot of expansion outside right now, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, to be able to digitize this process and come into the internet age, obviously you've got a lot of people in different locations making different technology decisions. So there are lots of proprietary systems built in different marketplaces, sometimes with very unique things for their market, but sometimes with similar things across markets that were built differently. And this is how you get a lack of standards. You have decentralized, siloed technology systems. And even as the real estate industry is consolidating from 1,000 MLSs down to 500, where we have today, that's still a lot of opportunity for there to be disjointedness between technical systems. So that's why RESO came along through some of the smartest people in real estate tech, was to kind of tackle that lack of uniformity and ability to interoperate. But Josh, you could probably talk more about kind of the technologies as they evolved through that time.
Yeah, I actually was traveling around ripping old terminals out and putting web servers in 1999. That was a big move, moving to web servers, and that kind of stimulated a lot of this, because then people started to interact in a more regular way. It wasn't just go pick up this feed, but at the time when RETS was created back in the late 90s, early 2000s, people were just basically exchanging data on FTP sites, and very unstructured, very different from each of those 1,000 markets. And as the technology entered the marketplace, people just needed that efficiency. So RETS was really the first wave. It was their own standard, and it accomplished a lot. A lot of people like to give it a hard time, talk maybe negatively about it. I would say it's probably, in terms of dollar value transacted, one of the most successful standards of all time. If you think about, proptech transacting over 20 years and then the valuation of that, that's a huge amount of money. So, but we needed an improvement still. We needed to kind of come around to how the world works now, with JSON-based web APIs and a data dictionary. So that's really the value that RESO brought in, was a transition from RETS into using like a dictionary-based system or metadata, and then also standardizing the transport layer so that we're using what the rest of the world is.
Yeah. And I think that decentralization is such a good feature for the real estate industry. I mean, if you look at, how to build a robust system, you want some decentralization, you want some localization, especially in the real estate industry, because you don't necessarily want somebody in New York City dictating how in Lexington, Kentucky, where I live, transacts real estate and who controls the local market here. So I think that the decentralization of the industry is really a beautiful thing, but it brings up, technology challenges, which I think RESO is doing a great job of addressing some of those. One question I do have on, the way it's evolved and kind of that decentralization was how were the borders of these associations decided? So you've got, these regional MLSs and really some cases very small MLSs and associations. How were those borders created? Was it a very natural kind of process, or were there very, kind of direct lines that people created?
Initially, a lot of this had to do with realtor associations. So there was a concept called jurisdiction, which was in policy. So associations would own their own MLS, and they would have a jurisdiction, and that would be the marketplace that they would cover. Obviously, in real life, consumers don't follow jurisdictions as to where they work. They work in natural market areas. And so you saw combinations of MLSs coming together and joining, becoming regionals in some cases. You saw a recognition of that in policy at the National Association of Realtors to say an association might have a jurisdiction, but an MLS has a service area. And whether that's one neighborhood or it's 4 states, MLSs should be free to support the marketplace based on what their consumers need and what their brokers need. And so that's, I think, where we've seen a lot of success for the regionals, and starting to move more toward having the organizations there that are needed by the marketplace, a lot of people would argue that 500 MLSs are still a lot more than the marketplace needs. But it's certainly better than 1,000. And these MLSs being sort of freed from the shackles of the idea of being constrained geographically has been a really good thing for market competition.
Yeah, and I want to hear y'all's thoughts on what's driving consolidation these days, because Josh and I, one cool thing on the call that we went through was kind of the pace of consolidation has been rather constant over the last several years. So what's driving consolidation within the market, and what effect does that have on the MLSs across the country? And then one thing to maybe tag on to that might be related is some associations like here in Lexington, they're separating the MLS out of their association. What's kind of that play there? So get into some of that.
I can take the boring part, and then Josh can take the interesting part, because a large part of that was, again, a policy, was an initiative through the National Association of Realtors to create core standards. So associations, which may run MLSs, had requirements of the organization to be able to support their members with certain services, certain products, certain features that kind of ensured a minimum standard of service, because realtor members are paying for this service and expecting that they're going to get that kind of service. So that really created a situation where some very small MLSs just didn't have the ability to live up to core standards, and therefore gave up their MLSs in a lot of cases, which became part of a larger regional. But there are obviously also a lot of technology reasons for that. So Josh, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I'll talk about decentralized here in a second and how standards address that. But borders are interesting. They always have been. Why would you draw a line at your street and then not do business across the street from you, right? I mean, these things grow organically. What usually happens with associations when they're joining MLS is they find there's some kind of strategic advantage to have the efficiency gain from 4 or 5 of them to get together. So I worked at Heartland MLS for a while. And there's other boards who participate there, but they're brokers. It's the same brokers at all those different boards. And those brokers had access to all the different feeds that we offered, right? So it was purely an efficiency thing happening. On the decentralized side, it's very challenging, because how do you take something with 500 plus markets and make it kind of look normal? Well, you use standards for that. And what RESO standards do is it gives the appearance that there's a national MLS because of the standard, without there being a national MLS. I agree with everything you said earlier. It'd be really hard if there was one body to do this, and then you have 500 local markets, each with their individual needs. How would those be met? I mean, a lot of the data is, you can put it in the standard, right? And that would work in that sense. But we have a lot of meaningful local data that these people have contributed. So I think taking a standards-based approach with a common, gateway that makes the whole industry look the same is the right way to go.
Yeah. And, the idea of standardization, I'm sure, has been around for a long time, but, what organization or what was the original conception of RESO? Talk about, the really early stages of how the group came together and really how it's evolved.
Well, Josh is drinking his coffee, but he's actually been involved on the technical side for longer than I have, so you might as well take that.
Yeah, it was really that RETS movement. Thanks, Sam. But I think you have some things to say here too, by the way. It was really RETS. People started to try to do these individual custom integrations, market to market. It's just too expensive. It takes too much time. I mean, if you have to map 100,000 data elements, it takes time. If you have to do that for 1,000 markets, that's brutal, right? So it was just purely born out of the need. RETS wasn't just a read-only technology. It also offered update. You could write back, and we need that now. We're working on that now. These are kind of the things that any healthy ecosystem needs, right? If you want to do an integration with somebody, that integration kind of looks the same. Typically, that's with a big vendor, right? So their own API provides that kind of standardization, if you would. But with us, that's essentially what we're going for. Like if you wanted to connect to Facebook and pull information from a Facebook graph, or Google, for example, right? You get a pretty consistent experience. So that's always been the goal, and it really did start in about 2000 with RETS. So long time goal here.
Yeah, and so boots on the ground for your brokers. One example, obviously the MLSs are trying to supply technology and services for their brokers, but the brokers themselves deal with these decentralized marketplaces. So I was a broker for 20 years. I sold, managed, and then worked with the ownership team as we had a franchise, and we actually purchased another franchise in another state. So you start moving across marketplaces and different MLSs, and you find that your best laid plans in Seattle don't actually work out when you expand to Spokane, because it might be a showing service, it might be a broker back office tool like an accounting system, it might just be listing input, transaction management, e-signatures. If these things don't integrate well, now you as a broker are telling your agents, well, if you're selling a listing in Seattle, use these 3 tools, but if you're doing it in Spokane, use these 3, and also you're going to have to double enter that listing into our back office system because it doesn't integrate. You can imagine now when you go across state lines, not only do you have those issues, but you have state licensing issues, which require you to have different documentation. That never goes away. And so that speaks to the actual value in some cases of having those local organizations employing some of those rules. Now, we do see MLSs that can serve multiple states, but they have to be able to cover the different nuances and requirements of those different jurisdictions. So there is a lot of complexity to the industry, and it starts right at the state licensing level. But I would repeat, for the prop tech pioneers perspective, it still may not require us to have 500 entities to cover services for different marketplaces. And that's not a rare opinion. Clearly, that's the direction of the industry from consolidation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just on another note there, I just want to add something. Sam mentioned the brokerage perspective, but think about it from the other side. Say I'm one of those products, right? Like the DocuSigns, the dot loops, etc.
We have to mention all of our members now that you mentioned a couple.
Okay, go ahead. I'm just kidding. Well, to all of our members, right? Any product like that needs to do business across boundaries, they're just not going to survive if they have to treat every market differently each time. It's too much money. Mapping's too difficult. But then there's also the end goal, which is the consumer perspective. Imagine if you're trying to build a product that consumers can use, like a portal, right? Large portal, Zillow, Redfin, etc., homes. Those things wouldn't be possible, at least without enormous budgets, if they didn't have an efficient way to pull the data in across the entire United States or multiple countries. Consumers wouldn't have the kind of experience they're looking for. And a lot of consumers maybe only look in their own local markets, say, I live in the East Bay and I want to look in San Francisco. I can look across the Bay pretty easily, but maybe I want to move back down, south, Southern California. I want to search down there. I can do that all from one site without that vendor spending, tremendous amounts of money and have access to all that data. So that's really the consumers are the main goal at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and Josh, you've been a startup founder, several times, from a startup perspective, really you want that healthy startup environment and ecosystem within an industry. When you have that standardized data layer that we can plug into, it allows there to be competition and for the best products to kind of work their way to the surface. Now, just having standardized data is not necessarily the last thing that needs to be solved, because there's so many other layers that startups have to get through, but it's a starting point. I think it's one of the most important things that needs to happen there. So that we can scale across the U.S. So we're not having to build unique integrations into each market that we're going to and from. So even, it's every stakeholder within the industry needs that kind of standardized layer. Now, when you all look at your all's work and you say, okay, how are we doing? What KPIs are you paying the most attention to track the progress of adoption or, of the success of your all's work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure Sam has some stuff to say here too. And that is the major turning point of RESO for the last few years. I just want to come back to something you said a second ago, though, with startups and licensing, because we could talk about all the things that RESO is doing to help with the standardization process, but there's still more that needs to be done. And I think there's some opportunity for RESO to help there too. As a startup, I worked for, roughly 50 or 60 different startups launching their products. What would often happen is that the licensing process is uncertain, indefinite. They don't know what kind of data they're going to get when they, finally flip the switch. And that might be 6 months after they start the licensing process. So during that time, they're basically dead in the water and can't make any progress at all if the developers in that company don't know what kind of data they're going to get. And so, they could be doing meaningful work during that time, but from the startup perspective, they're just stalled. And if they're spending money during that time, their burn rate is going to put them out of business before they ship the product a lot of times. I've been in cases where that's happened. So, we'll come back to this point, but, RESO's trying to do some things as well to maybe help with licensing.
Well,
We don't get involved with licensing at all. We have nothing to do with the licensing process. But I think there's some things we can do on the data side to help the licensing process.
let's stick on that topic while we're there, because and we can get back to the KPIs and
Yeah.
that question. But I just went through that. You literally almost just perfectly described what we struggled. We came up against as Simba was, we launched the company, and we raised venture capital. We had a certain burn rate, and once we got into the MLS landscape, we had traction. There was a good amount of interest in what we were doing, on the value we were providing, MLS members, and we launched in a couple markets. But what we soon learned was it's not as simple as just getting an MLS to say, yes, we'll work with you. There's so much more that goes into that. And I wish, in hindsight, I would have had a better understanding of that part of it. And that's part of why this podcast now exists, is to help spread, these learnings. But what we ran into was, we got the distribution, we worked with a couple MLSs, but really what we should have done in hindsight was build a product that felt much more native, much more integrated into the MLS landscape, so that when an agent found us, the data was there was SSO, and that documentation and the awareness around how to build that. Well, there's not a whole lot there. So for instance, Josh, when you and I jumped on a call not too long ago, we were kind of riffing on some of these ideas on how the industry can help startups. And it really kind of starts with documentation. And, RESO has done a great job with data dictionary and so many other parts of your documentation, but the individual MLSs need to do a much better job here, which is, what kind of data do you get? What kind of data feeds do we have? How does that work? And then what does the process of working with us and integrating with us look like? Here is who you need to talk to. Here's what you need to have in place. Maybe you need to be certified with RESO. And let's put out a list of, hey, here's what it looks like to work with us and your expectations, so that we can kind of cherry pick which MLSs to go to first and how we need to build our tech team and things of that nature. Because really, I didn't have any inside information, and I wasn't involved in the industry. I was not an insider. I came in with nothing. And so I had to navigate and bring on people like Bill Fowler to really help us navigate that. And there were many things in hindsight that we would do differently. And we might have been able to pivot a little faster if some of that documentation was there, versus just play the game of talking to everybody and learn via conversation. We're just trying to build. If I had the information to build, that'd be great. So I don't want to have to talk to a million people to learn how to build. I want to see how to build. And so that was one of the things, Josh, you and I talked about, was better documentation. I don't know if you want to riff on that more.
Yeah, there's the RESO side of that, and there's the industry side. And maybe Sam won't like what I'm going to say next, but on the industry side, there's been some incentive to try to have like a common application, kind of like there are for universities, right? And that doesn't mean that you can apply once and get into all those markets like you can for universities. It's more of the format of the application process is more standardized. So maybe you want to say something about that, Sam?
Well, I think there's two sides to that, right? First of all, as you said, the MLS side, you have to be comfortable in this space with the fact that MLSs are 1,001 flavors, and you're going to work with organizations that have a staff of 100 and a totally robust, automated, efficient data access process. And then you're going to work with other organizations that have one staff member. Maybe they have a part-time staff member. This is a real situation where a broker is also part-time the person who's running the MLS, and the vendor in a lot of ways operates the MLS. Whether or not that's the way an MLS should be run, that's the reality. So it's a difficult thing for a proptech startup to come in and say, I'm going to have to talk to the vendor to figure out all of the steps in applying for data in this case, whereas in this other one, I can just fill out the form and I'm done. But that's the reality of the process. So we've had some members. This is a long-term issue. Council of MLS has actually put out best practices. This is an organization, CMLS, that helps everyone sort of up their game because of the wide range of capabilities of MLSs. One of their best practices is to produce all of this information on the MLS's website, that a potential data consumer should be able to see what kind of a data feed it looks like, what the process is, who the contact person is, etc. Again, seems like a straightforward thing, but it's not. in a lot of MLSs today yet. So what some of our members suggested, and Josh was alluding to, as well, is what if we knew all of those processes, because all of your prop tech companies have gone through this process somewhere. Everyone has gone through each one of these markets. There's a vendor out there who has done this work. But what if we aggregated that all together into documentation where anybody coming into the industry could say, I'm going to go into this market in Northern Kentucky and I'm going to have to do A, B, and C. But over in Southern California, I'm going to need to do X, Y, and Z. And these are the feeds and this is the timeline. This is a monstrous project, yes, but it's a continual challenge for prop tech companies, for startups. We say when we start our meetings at RESO strives to create competition in the marketplace. Now that's for incumbents to make new products, but it's to help startups and new companies come in and compete and up everyone's game. So these are the kind of things that, we kind of talk about standards as we need to bring order out of chaos. That's what our job is to do. And the landscape for understanding and accessing data in the MLSs overall, if you look at 500, is chaos. And so those kinds of initiatives are probably valuable things that our members can come together and work on and make it a little bit easier for a prop tech company to play within the rules, but to scale their product a lot faster.
Yeah. And one thing, Josh, we talked about that. I love the idea of that. I'd love to, maybe it's a teaser on what's to come, but, sandboxes, Austin has some data that startups can access, but, how does RESO and other organizations within the industry create sandboxes for us to play with? Again, Josh and, myself and, many other startup founders, we just want to build, and a sandbox is a great way to just start building and then take what we've built and show it to people and say, hey, look at this. Can you get excited about this? Where does sandboxes play into this, and where are we at with the progress of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we're excited to be working on that feature for the future. It'll be the future roadmap. But I just want to zoom out a little bit. So there's kind of, 3 stages of development when you're trying to start off. There's starting the licensing process that usually involves outlining what role you're entering the market as, demoing the products, outlining what your product does, et cetera. There's certain rules and regs that have to be followed during that process where if something's reviewed and it's violating the rules and regs, then they're probably not going to grant you access until you fix it. So that process alone takes a while. And then let's just say you're a provider who has started that process in a few different markets. Knowing where you're at in that process is very difficult right now. So RESO does have some standards, I think, that are popping up in R&D that would at least help communicate where in the licensing process somebody is. And if you are a vendor then who has 10 or 15 markets, you don't have to continue to keep following up with them, and you might have to anyway, right? But you can kind of know what your status was and what the next action items are. And that's really hard to track sometimes. Those conversations tend to be very organic and spider out in a lot of places during the review process. So if we can keep that more, standardized, that would be good. And then finally, like we're saying, there's the sandbox server. Now, what is that idea? Why would it help? Well, a lot of times the MLS doesn't necessarily want a new incumbent coming into the market who's never done business before and doing crazy things with their data. And we've had a couple instances of that happening before, that people either, intentionally or unintentionally, they misuse or, this is the broker's data, right? And so they have to be a little bit protectionist there because they can't have people giving that out willy-nilly to the wrong person, right? So there's a lot of risk for the MLS to grant a license to a new incumbent because they might not know what they're doing, or they might intentionally misuse the data. What we can help them do probably at the RESO side, since we've certified all these markets now, we could actually spin up a realistic test server for a developer to work on and connect to in a sandbox environment. And they could do all their work that they need to do on the pre-licensing phase there, do a full demo for the MLS. There's no risk for them anymore, right? And then once they're happy with that and they go through that iteration process, they're already ready to hit the ground running because the conversion has already been done, right? There's no waiting 6 months for the review process and all the hypotheticals that go along with that, and then getting access to the data and starting the conversion 6 months later. The developers can start from day one. So that's really the goal that we're working toward. We have the framework for that in place now with all the certification data, and now we just need the time and resources to build it. We could build that in a month if we had the time and resources right now. It'll probably be more like next year.
Yeah. That's a good opportunity for a question here on where your resources come from. So we talked about the origin of RESO and kind of your all's goals and what standardization means. Let's talk about before we get back to KPIs. Where do your resources come from? How do you fund this, because it's a nonprofit, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're a nonprofit. We're an organization that exists for a purpose. So it's a good reminder, when we get together at our conferences and our events that, we don't exist if it weren't to create that competition and those efficiencies for the industry. So we're a member dues driven organization primarily. Our members are the National Association of Realtors, lots of MLSs and realtor organizations, technology companies. You'll see most of the largest technology vendors in the real estate space are our members, large brokerage organizations. And then we have other companies that see the benefits in the industry who may be adjacent. Assessment companies, local governments. We've actually had inquiries from government regulators in other countries who work in the real estate space. So we get a wide variety there. We do have events where we have sponsorships, where there's certainly revenue from those sort of things. We have a course called Working with Real Estate Data, which is something that a lot of folks use for new prop tech companies to understand all of the cruft of the industry that still exists, to speed up their education, and for other companies who want to onboard new employees who haven't yet learned the intersection of association and policies and MLS and brokerage and licensing and data rules at the MLS level. So, we do have these products. We've got some premium products that Josh will talk about on the RESO analytics platform in terms of alignment reports, but primarily we're a member dues driven organization, and certification of technology systems is a large part of the benefit that member organizations get by being members.
Yeah. And I've helped on two of those. I'm a RESO member, and it's been great. I'm really excited about what you all are doing. But the other one, I got certified, not RETS, Red B. I got certified, so took that course. It was great. I learned a lot. Almost participated in the third way, which was a sponsorship. It's funny because I wanted to say that because the origin of this podcast was the last RESO. I really wanted to be a sponsor, and we're a scrappy early startup, so I'm like, I don't know if I want to spend that much. And so I'm like, I still need to figure out a way to get in front of that audience. Let me do something. Let me hack it. And so I was like, I could put together a podcast and get some cool guests on. And when everybody's traveling to the conference, I'll share it with everybody. And so I launched it, had some great guests and some big names, and it got a lot of listens. And I got on the ground at RESO, and several people I'd never met, random people were walking up saying, "Hey, love the podcast." And so it worked. I hacked my way around your all's sponsorship. So funny story there. One day, maybe I'll be a sponsor one day, but I have participated in two of those ways you guys fund the organization. So,
and we appreciate that. And that's,
for sure.
a good reason to come to conferences, not just for the content and the work group works, which are obviously, the primary work is moving standards forward. But a lot of people come in conferences to get in front of the right people. And there are a lot of technology decision makers who come to RESO conferences.
For sure. Let's get back to kind of the KPIs now. Talk about the progress. So how do you all track your progress and, your all's ability to identify success and continue to grow those metrics? Talk about what those KPIs are.
Yeah, our strategic priorities come down from our board of directors, which are from our member organizations. So you'll see technology companies, MLSs, National Association of Realtors, and it comes down to utilization. We obviously have to be a financially sustainable organization to do what it is we're incorporated to do. But after that, it's utilization in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is standards are important. They're valuable. A great spec, great feedback, great membership, adoption by the organization, all important and valuable. But it's utilization where the rubber meets the road. If the marketplace uses those products, we're succeeding. If the marketplace is not using them, we've got work to do. So that's the number one thing that we highlight in our internal meetings, in our board meetings, to our membership at our conferences, our web API and data dictionary. Primarily, our two key sort of flagship products are those being used in the marketplace. And the great thing is we can now show that much more clearly with the RESO analytics platform, and being able to show that objectively without having to oversell what's happening in the marketplace, to be able to say, these organizations are certified, they're converting their customers, over from an older RETS data feed over to the Web API data feed. Not just an MLS has a Web API service, but their customers are using the Web API data feeds. And then obviously there's that layer within the Web API data feed, which is, if it's certified, that means we've certified compliance with data dictionary as well. So those kind of two things go hand in hand. And Evan, I think you've commented on this. I heard in a previous podcast where you were worried because we were only at 25% adoption or utilization of Web API. And it was probably a couple conferences ago when you did that podcast. But 2 years ago, we were at low single-digit percentages. So the time it takes to get the trust, build the trust in a standard so that the implementers will spend the money, so that the administrators and operators of the MLSs will convert their customers, and the marketplace sees that it works and it's valuable, so they're willing to do that work, is really kind of the key. So we're over a third of the industry converted within about 2 years. I think we actually might have just crossed over about 40% in utilization. I'll have to take a look at that last packet again. But the point there is we still have work. We've still got a long way to go, but the trend line is, I wouldn't say a hockey stick, but similar. The growth is pretty dramatic for a less than 2 year period. It'd be difficult to see that slowing down a whole lot. It's certainly not going to flatten out as the industry reaches a critical mass. It's just a requirement practically for other folks to get on board with this as in terms of progress. We're having these conversations with international organizations now. I was just on a call with some folks in Europe who are looking at MLS systems and whether they need a new standard, whether they should just build their own or use what we have. And we come back to that trust factor. Is there something in the marketplace that has proven itself, that's been certified and is being utilized in the marketplace? Why would you want to reinvent that wheel? Why would you want to go out and spend all this time and money on something brand new that folks are not sure is going to get adopted? At the point you hit that critical mass of trust by the technology implementers, you've got the right solution there.
Yeah. And we're seeing this in other industries. A great example that's really relevant and current right now is Tesla's charging standard is being adopted by all of them because they've reached that critical mass and they've got so much adoption. Yeah, you're right. On my first RESO would have been 2020 in the fall. It would have been, I guess, Sarasota. You guys were at 25% adoption on the web API. And then I put out, I think it was an article, and then you commented and said, well, we're getting up close to 30. And so it's great to hear now that's over about getting close to 40. That's great growth. And it's really exciting because, the importance of what's going on here. You mentioned international there. I'm super intrigued because there are some markets. Well, just to look at a more even macro level, the United States is the envy of the entire world when it comes to real estate, right? I mean, we have such an amazing marketplace here because of how the industry's evolved and, the systems we have in place. While frustrating, they really have created a healthy market for consumers to buy and sell homes. And so we really are the envy of the world when it comes to real estate. I've got friends that live in Portugal, and I was on a call with one of them, and they're like, nobody around here knows who owns anything. It's like when somebody buys a home, nobody knows what's going on. And so I'm like, well, they need an MLS system and they need some standardization, I'm sure. So how do you all think about international expansion? Is it more organic? Are you going outbound? And then give us an idea of maybe some markets that are international that have already adopted and, how quickly this gets adopted in those local markets. I'm sure just like in any industry, there's the way that people have done business so long, they're comfortable with. And so when you go into a new market and there wasn't even an MLS system to begin with, and people are just kind of, I don't even know how you do it without an MLS, but what does it look like when you go into a new market, and how do you all think about expanding?
Yeah, I think there's things that we may do what we see as better than in other countries and things that we do less well. For example, land registries. We have these terrible systems in the US where we have to go out and look at counties and townships and try to figure out where property, APN numbers are, whereas other countries have national land registries where it's really easy to identify parcels. So we've got some potential solutions for that to talk about too. But generally, you're right. The MLS is the envy of the world, and it's far more efficient when it's run with standards. So Canada has really picked up the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years in terms of standardization across the country. So they've adopted RESO's data dictionary at the Canadian Real Estate Association level. So there is a Canadian National Data Standard that was kind of the standard for a long time, still exists in systems like RETS does today. But the larger organizations are moving to the data dictionary, to Web API. I think we have now associations in every province in Canada, having joined, maybe not Northwest Territories, but generally everywhere else joining, some of them working on getting certified, a couple of them certified. But Canada is really the only other country that has a similar organized real estate system. And that term for the technology people who aren't in the organized space is more about national associations, MLSs, state licensing, and their relationship to brokers and consumers. There's a whole very official set of regulations and rules and policies and laws that we kind of call organized real estate. When we move outside of Canada and the US, it's very different. Often it's not all that structured. For example, Mexico, you don't have to have a license to sell real estate. So our relationships there are with trade organizations and technology vendors, but they're working through CRMs to move listings and data around instead of an MLS system. We have a member that just signed up 10 Latin American countries with an MLS system because they have a great technology foundation. We have another one who just signed up Ecuador and Dominican Republic because they've built the technology. And a lot of times when we go outside the US, the MLS concept is so different that even though why we know that is the value that makes these marketplaces work, they want to see the technology. They want to know the technology is going to work. And that's been kind of the sales pitches. Recently we've had companies in Saudi Arabia. There's a new Egyptian MLS popping up, Turkey, Czech Republic. So we're seeing a lot of expansion, and it may just be visibility, but it may even be something like Canada, which is proving out nationwide that these things work. It's not just an American experiment. RESO was always built to be an international real estate standard, not even just MLS. It's international. And Josh, you could probably talk about kind of some of the international standards that we've got that are going to facilitate that expansion.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. One thing that's important to point out, RESO standards don't require that these other countries have an MLS to use the standards, right? If the technology providers just adopt the standards, that also helps to accomplish the goal. Say there's 4 or 5 different providers that are entering those markets. If they're not using standards, it's the same problem we have here. Every person who does an integration is going to have to do a custom integration. If they're all using the standard, even if they have their own, unique identities, they could still push data around, and people could still build integrations for things like showing or tour products using RESO standards. So one thing we've tried to do in the last few years is really decouple our thinking. Think about things more in terms of moving data dictionary data around than the whole API structure, and that makes it a lot lighter and easier for people to deal with. If they could just flip on RESO data feeds with their existing APIs and not change much else, and that accomplishes the goals of saving all that mapping time. Another thing that RESO's done, which we didn't have before, is we added a way to support localization and internationalization to our data sets. So we provide that consistent shape through the dictionary, but if you want to supplement what's there with your local translations, even down to the state level or even postal code if you really wanted to, you could do that and still be using a standard. And what that means is that you could call the thing something differently in your product, but if somebody needs to push that data around, they're always going to have that predictable mapping. So, this has really got a lot of interest from other people. This is what's allowing our international expansion and the fact that we have these standards now. And I'm looking forward, to having a conference in some of these other countries. Japan would be a nice one on the list. So
yeah, no, that'll be fun. Before we get into, Josh, where you live and breathe, some of the core tools you all build from a product perspective, I guess the last question on kind of the evolution and the progress of RESO is what's holding some markets back? So for any market that hasn't been as progressive and maybe adopted RESO yet, or is either maybe refusing to adopt RESO for any given reason, what are some things that are slowing adoption of RESO right now?
Yeah, I can answer that one in a second. I just wanted to kind of qualify those numbers earlier about conversion. even if people haven't switched off their REST feeds yet and switched people over to the web API, those markets still have web API feeds. We've granted 650 endorsements so far in roughly 500 markets. So everybody basically has this ready to go. It's a matter of, like Sam said, it's extremely expensive, especially for a small organization, to convert something that's working and making money for all those brokers and all those offices over to a new technology. They have to see it work. And the stuff we're going to show you later on here in a few minutes, it's a demonstration of the fact that it is working. When they see that RESO can collect data and draw a map using the entire United States, showing that we can pull all the data feeds using the standard, that gives these markets some predictability and some assurance that if they take the plunge, it's actually going to work. If we didn't have that map, how would you know that it's actually working? So the other way we know it's working is that anecdotally, we hear things from integrators that it used to take weeks to convert, and now it takes days instead. And that's a huge jump from where we were before. RETS never solved that problem. RETS was really the Wild West, didn't have huge amount of standardization at the data level. It had more standardization at the transport level. So lots of mapping to be done with RETS.
Yeah,
We're fixing that mapping problem.
I think Eric at Tribus and Solid Earth just gave you all a big shout out. I saw on one of their transitions.
Yeah,
that
that's
was
what I
cool
was
to
thinking
see.
of when I said that. But
Yeah.
it's happening a lot. It's not just them. I hear that from other people that, hey, this stuff is actually working now. We're willing to spend money and build stuff with it.
Yeah. So get into what's holding some back. What's keeping progress?
FUD. It's all FUD. I'm just kidding. Awareness, education, cost, planning issues. I mean, from a logistics perspective, it's just rough to do a conversion. It's never an easy thing. And there's always going to be kind of that long tail, right? And then there's always going to be the early adopters who just bite the bullet and do it. And we're kind of probably in the middle right now, I would say, because a lot of the larger markets have adopted RESO standards and they're using them for live feeds. And by that, I mean, since it's a larger market, that captures a large share of the brokerages who are putting data into the market, right? So, but the smaller, MLSs, they're resource constrained. It's fine if you have 150 people to do this conversion, but what if you only have one person who's working part-time in an office? How do you get your customer to convert? The data can be perfectly standardized, right? So that's not the issue there. It's just taking that plunge and shutting off those feeds, and really that's up to them. They need to be, pretty dedicated to enforcing, setting and enforcing timelines as to when they're going to do the conversion. So let Sam actually get speak better to that one. Sam?
No, I mean, you described it well, and it's not an exciting answer, but inertia, friction, time, money, jobs, resources. It's the things that you would just expect. That it's in a way, it's like changing your oil. There's nothing exciting about it. It costs you time and money, but you need to do it. And yet, if the car keeps running and you don't have the time or the money, you're not going to do it. So, that's a very simplified example because your systems actually improve when you upgrade to standardized data. But that's really what it is. It is not a big exciting thing to come tell your organization we're going to spend a lot more time and money and pain this year on something that a lot of it is going to feel the same when we're done with it. And actually, a lot of our members and customers are going to give us grief for having done it. That we all know it's actually going to be better for us long term, better for the industry, but you've got to make the decision to do it. And it's really hard for an MLS administrator in a situation where they're not fully empowered to make tough decisions and move forward to do that. And for others, without a ton of staffing or resources, they need to see the larger organizations do it first, see what works well, what didn't work well, so that we don't all go make the same mistakes. So we brought a lot of MLSs together actually this past year to write a web API transition guide to help them move their customers off RETS over to web API, and to do it in a way that they have the fewest rough edges during that process. It's not a painless process no matter what, but we think this at least makes it much easier for the organizations that may not have the staff and training time to put together this big plan. And so, as Josh said, everybody's got that web API service now. It's a question of, do you move your customers across to web API from RETS? And while some organizations will say we're going to keep supporting both because we want to, and we think that's helpful for our customers, the vast majority that we've talked to have said our leadership decided we needed to do it all when we did this so that we could show our marketplace that we're unified in this and that we know this is better. We know this is the way to do it. We need 100% and we need a date, because if we don't have a drop dead date, then the vendors will wait. And the vendors converting are the same as the MLSs converting. A lot of folks are going to wait to be the last possible ones to avoid the pain. And that's not a negative, it's a reality of the situation. We think doing a lot of advertising and promotion of the folks that are making the conversion and are moving forward helps motivate everyone, whether you feel that's a carrot or a stick for your organization. It's just objective information that helps move people forward.
Yeah. Now, one thing I want to make sure we do on this podcast is there's video. So if anybody's listening on Spotify or Apple or Google, there's going to be a cool demo here. One of the things I want to talk about, you guys are building some really awesome products using this data. You mentioned the web API, but really the analytics product, Josh, you gave me a demo of on a previous call. I was just kind of blown away by how useful it is, both to just being able to track adoption and seeing what data is out there and how each market is compared to another. But really from a startup perspective, from somebody building a product and entering the market, really understanding the analytics behind the data in a given market and what fields are consistent across markets and what's being used is super valuable. So I really wanted to do a quick demo here, and Josh is a perfect person to have on this podcast. He might be embarrassed, but we were going to do this podcast yesterday and he stayed up all night working. I love that. That's the startup grind. That's exactly what we need in the industry. And he stayed up 4 last night working more. So this is kind of product stuff that I love to do. And I really enjoyed talking with Josh in the last call. And this has been great so far. So I wanted to make sure we give a demo here of what you all are building so we can kind of visualize, not just listen to what you guys have done progress wise. So yeah, Josh, go ahead.
No, it sounds good. I just kind of want to say here, like, we do have the exciting things coming because we've certified people and collected this data, but just the exercise of collecting it has been a huge step for RESO. It's converted RESO into a data-driven organization. In the work groups now, we use this data to help us make more informed decisions about what's actually being used in practice. And we can achieve a lot of that in like the data dictionary work group. If we get 80 people who show up in the meeting, they have a pretty good sense of what's happening because they're involved. But we have a good sense of what's happening in 500 plus markets, right? And if somebody wants to change a field to something or add something new, we can look through our data sets and see if there's something out there that people are doing right now that match that requirement. And that's much better than making something up, right? If you have something that's already being used by 85% of the country, why would you make up something new and force everybody to switch to it? Doesn't make sense. So just the step of being able to draw the map beyond all the other cool things we're going to do with it has changed RESO considerably as an organization. So I'll go over this quickly. I'm just going to rush through some of the stuff. These numbers on the side, they're going to change as we kind of click through things. What do they mean? Well, that's kind of important for the purposes of this podcast as well. Advertise means that they say they have it in their metadata. Okay, so you connect to the server and you ask what the server has, and they say, I have this. List price, standard status, whatever, accessibility features. That's usually much different than when you actually get in the data set. And it's roughly 3 times more elements advertised than what's actually in the data set. So if somebody, if the industry set, well, actually we can see this. We don't have to hypothesize here. Almost again. So if we look at what's available through certification, here's our public site. It's at certification.reso.org. And what we show is once somebody is certified, this is the result of a fairly extensive process. It starts with the providers. They request that certification be done. They run the tests. They get their own comprehensive results about how they've done, trend information, performance, data availability. And so they can get their system really right before they hand off that approval to their customers, MLSs in most cases. And then once the MLS gets it, they have access to all the same information. If they don't like what the provider is doing at that point, they can just go and tell them to, fix it. And how do we do that? Well, you can see what I'm talking about with advertised here and we have available, and we've got fields and lookups. So RESO calls enumerations lookups. So we kind of stuck with the terminology. Advertise is what they say they support. They say that they have 1,562 fields across all resources. If we switch this to RESO, it's 869. We can see what the industry average there is, 462. If you just want to know about listing data, that's a property resource for RESO. So they advertise 600, basically everything that's in the dictionary, because this particular vendor supports everything in the dictionary. It's up to their customers to fill in that data. So in this particular market, their customer used 215 of those fields. That's extremely valuable for an integrator to know, because it's one thing to see that the field might be supported in the metadata, but what if your product actually needs data in that field? You need like show information with the time that the show is going to start. They say they have it on the server, but they don't have it in the data, right? That's a problem. So this is what the provider sees. Everybody sees this report. There's no different report from anybody. It's just about timing. First, the provider sees this when they do their test. Then they send a notification to their customers, the MLS, who sees the exact same information when they do their tests. And then if the MLS is comfortable with that, at that point, they have the ability to compare all these industry averages. Then they can push the button and then they show up as certified. So when I was logged in, you saw that there was, maybe 13 or 1400 versus, whatever has been published so far. So that's just something to keep in mind. For people coming to the site, this list of results is not all that's there. We've got people in various stages of certification. And we can see a lot of cases like Actress is a good one. Look how many different vendors they have in their market. Each of those different vendors has different data sets, different requirements, right? We can select amongst those and see. This is a side note there. We haven't pulled data samples for CoreLogic Trestle yet, so that's why there's a 0 there. They actually do have data, so bad example. But when you see the blue bars, that means that RESO's done its data sampling. And why is that important? Well, beyond the fact that it draws the map, you're going to see in a second, data sampling is a way for us to validate that, dates are dates, times are times, prices are prices, that kind of stuff. And then we can also figure out what's actually being used in practice, like enumerations and things, to figure out what those counts are, what those availability stats are. So it's really important that everybody has the blue bars at this point, long story short. And there's detail reports. People can go in and view the details as well. This goes and lets you drill down. So if you wanted to find all the RESO fields that were available 100% of the time, there they are. There's 29 in the property resource. And those 29 things that are available 100% of the time look like things that should be there. List price, MLS status, modification timestamp, right? City, country, county, or parish. So this kind of makes sense in terms of the data perspective. This was all opaque to everybody before. Now it's out there for anybody to go look at.
Yeah, which is important because as somebody that's building a strategy for both product and go to market, you need to know if you have data fields in your product that require this to be synced. You need to know that, hey, this market is potentially a great sales go to market, but from a product perspective, this is something we can also go to market in. And if that was opaque before, I can't even imagine what that process was like. I mean, it's just talking to a lot of people.
You can't imagine though, because it's that licensing process where you have to go through the entire licensing process first, get access to that server.
Yeah.
6 months later, you might start to figure out that thing doesn't have the data in the field you need. That's a problem.
Yeah, for sure. So this is extremely valuable. So keep going. I just want to make that point. Like for me, from a builder's perspective, this is huge.
And the blue bar there means that data is solid, right? That's the other thing that verifying the data does. It's one thing to advertise stuff, but if you never pull anything and check what's actually there, you could get a lot of surprises, right? So by the fact that we go and score, and it's pretty comprehensive. We run roughly 35,000 metadata tests to make sure that all the metadata is represented correctly, correct data types, no synonyms, etc. We're even adding a spelling checker to the dictionary for Data Dictionary 2.0, which will help even more. But then when we pull the data, that's real, right? That's exactly the experience that the consumer would have. So what RESO can do with that information is a lot. So that's advertised. We already talked about available as well. So yeah, we've tested some more people in the metadata than we have data for. We got 18. This is providers. That means like vendors, MLS vendors. We have other vendors too. There's some we haven't tested yet because when we first rolled this out, the availability part wasn't required. But, this number is coming up and we have some huge number of certifications. All these little dots here in this heat, there's a lot of layers to this map. It's a very complicated map. The dots in the heat are all the different markets we have, and these are self-reported geo-coordinates. So these are really at the market center, the MLS center, right? And that's pretty reliable because they know, where their offices is usually. So the heat here that you see is how much standardization do they have in their metadata? That's what they advertise. If they don't have a lot of standardization in their metadata, then their data probably doesn't have a lot of standardization. So, looking at the heat for how much is standardized is kind of a good thing. And, it's relative. So if we zoom in, the heat part will change a little bit, a little down the weeds here, but you can kind of see how that works, that, kind of the brighter spots here have a higher potential for having the stuff you want.
So those are markets that a startup or a vendor should look at and say, hey, this is probably a great place to start or enter because they've got clean, standardized data, and a lot of the fields are.
Not to interrupt, sorry. That's a good question because no, it's not enough. You need a lot more information than that. But yeah, that's absolutely a start. If you see a big bright spot on the map, it's a higher chance that you might have the data. And actually, you just hit the nail on the head. That's why I'm smiling. We used to have kind of this concept of platinum at RESO. And, the idea itself was great. Executive love to have those different models of, am I platinum, am I gold, or whatever. That was determined in interesting ways before. If we could make that more data-driven, that would be a great thing to say, well, I'm platinum because I have 90% availability in, standard fields, for example. But it wasn't happening before. And then people would assume maybe that if something was platinum, they could just connect and do business in that market easily. And why doesn't that work? Well, it's not because it was a bad idea. It's a great idea. It's because interoperability is not about platinum or whatnot. It's about alignment. It's about what data set does somebody have. You could even have two platinum providers in the data-driven arrangement that I mentioned a second ago, where they both have 90% standardization, but they're missing an intersection, right? They're not standardized on the part where they don't connect at that point. So, the brightness of the spots is one thing, but it's really about availability. And we have another layer for that, the sample per postal code layer. And these are all this is the mosaic of all the overlapping markets, some people call it disorder, that we have out there. And we could even restrict some of this to those providers in the market. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now, but if we wanted to figure out, which things are shared in the Bay Area, for example, where I am, we could tell what the circle that SF has and the circle that Berkeley has and the circle that the East Bay has, and figure out how much their data sets line up. So that's where RESO is going in the future with the alignment reports. We've got 3 alignment reports coming. The provider alignment report. In that case, that's where you have like multiple providers, going back to this actress example. These things likely do not line up even amongst themselves. So, you think they would, because if the data is being entered there, you'd think that anybody consuming data from any of those other vendors in the same market might have the same data sets. Well, they don't. And even if they do, in some cases, it's not called the same thing. So the provider alignment report is a chance for the MLS execs to make sure that they have some, synchronicity between the providers. And they pay for this now. They pay for it in custom mapping and custom integrations on the back end between their multiple systems. So there's a huge incentive for them to fix that beyond their customers. And then there's the market alignment report. And that answers the question of, okay, well, if I'm in San Francisco and I wanted to do a data share in the Bay Area, or an integration with, Bridge MLS here in Berkeley, what does that look like? How much time might that take? Where do we line up, right? And so we have some really nice reports coming there too, with Venn diagrams and showing, intersections and differences between things. So that starts to answer the data sharing case. There's a lot of initiatives to have statewide data shares. And if I filtered by some of these markets, you'd see in California, they're very progressive about this. A lot of these Northern California markets have huge coverage all the way up north to the top border, all the way down south to the south border. So they're already doing this in practice now. And then, this also helps with this NorCal Data Alliance, for example. They're one of our case studies. There's 7 markets here, and they've been trying to do integrations and spending, lots of money on custom programming for years now. And that's not because they're not, good or something. It's just because it's so hard to map tens of thousands of enumerations across markets, standardized or not, that if you don't have really good tools to do that, it's not going to be very successful. It's going to cost a lot of money. So those are the two products we have rolling out. We'll do a beta of those by the fall conference. So the fall conference is October, and we will give some demos of those then. But we also have, coming back to the startups and, prop tech pioneers, you can see where, since we have all this information, if I have a product that uses that information, we can also tell you which markets you can enter easily, right? And so that's another report that we're working on. And I have a small example here. This is for accessibility features field. If we toggle this filter on here, let's just say, sorry, I'm just let me mess with this a little bit. Let's look for all the people who have accessibility features greater than 50% of the time in the data sets. So I'll just turn this on here. When you do that, you start to see all those markets drop off. See, now the map has changed. Well, those are the markets you could enter if your product needs accessibility features. And we can do that with basically everything in the dictionary. So that if you know that you have 57 fields you need, that we can go in there and tell you where you can find those 57 fields or payloads, or we can base it on a market that you've already entered. Say you've already done one integration and you want to find all markets that have similar data sets so you can target them for your next integrations. We can provide that information for those people.
Yeah, I love that. This is such an exciting tool. I'm sure everybody in the industry has appreciated this, whether it's MLSs figuring out how to share data, the vendors, the large vendors, the MLSs, figuring out how, maybe they're going to expand their services across other markets. And then, as you mentioned there, the startups. I mean, this is great stuff. So the more awareness we can bring to this, and the work that you're doing, Josh and Sam, is great. So appreciate you giving the demo there. Is there anything else before we stop the demo you want to go over that you think is relevant to the audience?
I just think this is important to show that, people really are using this. This is available standard resource distribution. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that on average, most people have 6 resources from the dictionary. That's 239 markets have 6 resources. So that's a pretty full, data dictionary data set. If we only saw 1 or 2, then I'd be a little worried, right? But people are really adopting these things and using them for their customers. And you can see kind of what those top items are. It's what you'd expect for an MLS: property, member, office, open house, media, and the lookup resource, which is one of those things that helps with that internationalization. So I was very happy to see that 523 of those markets are using the property resource, for example. We only sampled 523, right? So everybody's using it. Good job. We have a little bit of work to do with some of these other ones at this point. But, we'll get there. And, for those of you watching who are familiar with RESO and the DDWiki, we've actually put all of our usage stats here as well. Every field, every enumeration in here, if we want to see list price, for example. If we go here and look at this, we've incorporated just very subtly this RESO analytics information into every item on the wiki. So everybody has list price. Every system supports it. And
didn't all have it before. We're finally at 100%.
Yeah, no, it's a new thing. We've updated these stats recently, so June 16th. This is interesting because there's only 98% of those organizations that used it, and I know from just personal experience that we only have 2 or 3 non-MLSs in there. So there's probably roughly 10 MLSs who are not using list price for some reason, and we know who they are as well. So we could do things like reach out to them, and we're going to be putting that information on the future certification reports. We've got this industry aggregate service that's powering all of this. And if MLSs are missing significantly used fields or enumerations when they're getting certified, we could just show them a report to say, hey, 98% of organizations are using list price. We didn't find it in your system. Maybe you should consider adding it, right? And so that's kind of provides a feedback loop back into the providers so that they can use this information to improve their systems.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah.
Thanks for walking us through that. One thing I wanted to end with here, I always try to end on positive, either advice or forward-looking statements. I've got kind of two questions. Either of you can answer, you both can answer them, or you guys can switch off. But what's one piece of advice you'd have to a new founder entering the space? You guys have both seen and done everything in the space and have just a breadth of experience. When you see somebody enter the space, what's one thing that your mind immediately goes, man, I hope they're doing this?
Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I would hope that they're using retail standards. I mean, hopefully they try to,
Right.
and we don't have some of those guides we want right now. I mean, we're working on that, but that people don't have to join RESO to become involved. Transport and certification have put all their stuff out there publicly right now because it's more important for us to make that accessible to those developers who need to do those integrations and to try to make them members. If we're doing a good job, they'll become members because they naturally want to participate in creating the standards, right? So, don't start with just assuming that you have to build everything from scratch for every market. The DD Wiki is a great place to look. As we showed, like 500 MLSs are using that kind of stuff. And then, the consumers should really insist to the MLSs and their vendors that they get Web API feeds. That'll make their lives a lot easier. I know we have some, slow adoption there, but if people really start asking for it because it's valuable to them, then the MLSs won't wait forever. They'll probably convert sooner rather than later. And then on the tech side, the biggest challenge is probably replication. And we'll get into all that, but RESO is trying to make replication easier. It's not a nice situation right now for somebody with a footprint in, a dozen markets or so, because they have to pull all that data. It's laborious. So maybe that wasn't the question you were asking, but those are the things that I think about beyond licensing when I'm trying to get started.
Yeah. And Sam, what about you?
Yeah, I think for startups, it would be understand the big picture before you dive in 100%. There are lots of layers to the industry that whether you like the way they work or not, they're there. You may have one broker tell you they've got a great feature and your product will fit that. You might find in different markets in different states that feature is not allowed, is illegal, or is just not likely to make it through the processes necessary to come to life and to scale. So, to be able to come into a market with a leader at the MLS organization, with a leading brokerage company, to ease your way in to working with an MLS, to getting data access, to having a personal contact you can call at that organization to find your way through the process versus coming in like a bull in a china shop as tech is smarter than you, watch us break things. It's frustrating. We understand that. It's frustrating for new technology. And I think everyone here would hope that it becomes less and less so. It needs to be more streamlined. It needs to get better. We want to hear that feedback from prop tech companies to tell us where we can help the industry get better there. But that doesn't change the current situation. And whether it's, taking our course, going to conferences, just sitting down with people at events and saying, here's what I'm trying to do. My broker in my MLS in my market thinks that's a good idea. Is it? And getting that additional feedback can really help folks spend a lot less money and time on things that may not eventually come to fruition.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was that bull in the china shop. It just came in and it helped to, and it's been working to do that. And it's humbling. It's humbling to come into this space and just realize the complexity. I love complex systems, and just once I got into it and figured out, I still don't know how it works, but once I got a better idea of how all this works, it humbles you. And now, I'm just trying to help, trying to spread some learnings, and that's what the purpose of this podcast is. And so I appreciate you all participating and being a part of it. So thank you all. I think
I do have a couple of things to add to this.
Yeah.
So I know I work for RESO. I've invested interest in saying, you should think about RESO here. But like Sam said, we have seasoned veterans who've been doing this for an extremely long time. Just those bar conversations of, I'm thinking about doing this. That's really helpful. Even just coming to a conference, even if you don't join or whatever, it's helpful. And there's nothing like that in the proptech space. I do want to say though that the vendors do an excellent job with documentation. They really do. So, if you're thinking about going to a market, you really want to look through that vendor's documentation and reach out to them. The vendors want to get you connected. They do. They want you to use their systems. And then, really that starting point, coming back to certification.reso.org, if you're thinking about going into a market, just go there and see if we've tested them yet. Because we're going to have everything you need to get started with mapping your data sets if we have a report for them. That's very valuable for a startup. So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you.
That bar talk, that's $1,000 an hour consulting for free by showing up and buying a drink for an MLS exec or a software lead and really getting the straight scoop. So that's where the business gets done.
Absolutely.
And they like drinks. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a human industry, and I love that. But also, like you said, Sam, it's just the way it is. It can be frustrating, but once you understand, how good the people are in it and how willing they are to help, and you figure out, how to navigate it, it's a fun space to be in, and it's an important space. Josh, you alluded to it earlier. Maybe Sam, you did. The most money that is transacted in all of the world goes across the MLSs. And that's super exciting for companies building within the space, is that they can be a part of that. So again, appreciate what you all are doing. The work of RESO is super important. Thanks for coming on and talking about it. I'm sure our audience will love it. So thanks.
Thanks, Evan.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.